So the way that I've written this is to think about first, well, what are the ways that pigs get diseases? And 99% of pig diseases come in with an infected pig. So the other 1%ers are aerosol. So obviously the respiratory diseases are more likely to be transmitted through aerosol. Humans have been known to transmit diseases, but there's really very few diseases that humans are actually going to bring into your farm, with the exception of influenza, which we'll touch on in a minute. It's more the clothes that the humans are wearing. So if you've been to, probably the most risky scenario is if you've taken your pigs to the abattoir and you walked around the lairage area with your boots on, and then you take those boots and walk around your own pigs. So most of the things that you transmit are going to be on your dirty clothes back to your pigs. And then there's a few diseases that other animals can transmit to your pigs. So I guess the first thing is, if you're going to get pigs, just make sure that the pigs don't have the diseases that you don't want. And I'll touch on the key ones at the end of the talk. But so, you know, talk to the person that owns the pigs, ask them questions about, well, do they know what diseases their pigs have? What are they vaccinating them against? Do they have a valid vet-client relationship? So do they have a vet that they talk to if they get a sick pig? Have they had any diagnostic work done, that kind of thing? Minimise the number of people that you buy your pigs from. So ideally, just have one supplier. I guess another way to bring in new genetics without bringing in new live pigs is through semen and doing your own artificial insemination, which is actually really pretty easy. Don't buy pigs at auction. I think that's the biggest trap that people do, is they go to sale yards and they buy pigs, and then they have no idea what diseases that they're buying in. Even the smallest property can still set up a little quarantine area before you bring your pigs, your newly purchased pigs, to mix with your own pigs. Ideally have a section where your new purchased pigs are kept for a while away from your own pigs. Once you've brought those pigs, your new pigs, in with your existing pigs, if the wheels fall off and they all get sick, well, there's no comeback. But at least if you've got a quarantine area, you've got a bit of time. If whoever's selling you the pigs finds out they actually have a really nasty disease, then you can offload the pigs that you've bought and you haven't damaged your own pig's health status. It's important to know who's visiting your farm and minimise, if you can, the number of people that go visit your pigs, because basically you don't want them bringing diseases in. And I would always provide site-specific boots and overalls. So even if they're just boot covers and disposable overalls, but just something so that you've got some way of controlling what bugs your own pigs are likely to be exposed to from the visitors. In terms of quarantine, the ideal quarantine would be to have your pigs separate for at least 6 weeks. Most diseases that pigs commonly get have an incubation period of shorter than 6 weeks, so they will express those diseases in that time. If you're reading the textbooks, it would say that you should have your quarantine area at least 3 kilometres away from your own pigs, and that is mainly because of a disease called mycoplasma pneumonia, which can blow about 3 kilometres, and it may possibly blow more, but 3 kilometres will be a relatively safe distance. Use sentinel pigs, and by that I mean have some of your own pigs. So you might have some bacon pigs that you're looking to sell, and you might house them with these newly purchased pigs during that 6 weeks. And that way, you know, if your pigs get sick, that there's something wrong with the ones that you've just bought. And other way around, if you newly purchased pigs get sick, at least that way you'll know that they're a bit more naive than the pigs you have. And it's important that you know, you vaccinate and worm those pigs before they enter your farm. We'll touch on that a little bit more later. Pigs are notoriously destructive, so it's important that you do have good fencing, and ideally that the fencing's electrified, or else your pigs are just going to be all over the place and you'll have no control over where they are. I mentioned providing farm-specific boots and overalls, and that's really to minimise the risk that anyone that's coming onto your farm is going to bring new diseases onto the property. I think one really important thing to remember is that when we had the H1N1 influenza outbreak back in 2011 in humans, that a number of pig farms were infected from the sick humans. So, and the tough thing about influenza is you're most infectious when you're incubating the disease, when you don't actually know you have it. But still, just be aware that you can transmit influenza to pigs, and pigs are actually known as a bit of a mixing vessel, so that you can get changes in the virus once they enter the pig. So it's an important one to be aware of. So I recommend, if you're going to have pigs, to get an annual influenza vaccination. It's not going to be 100% protective, but at least it's better than nothing. And for pigs, if they do get influenza, the clinical signs are similar to what you'll see in humans. So they'll be generally lethargic off their feed, they'll have a high temperature, they'll do a bit of coughing, and yeah, they won't feel well, but after a time they'll get over it. But it's certainly something that can reoccur seasonally in your pigs, so maybe one to try and aim to keep out. If you've got other critters on your property, just be aware of some legal things. So most pig feed will contain meat meal or food type substances, and so if you can't legally allow ruminants to eat that sort of food. So just be aware of that if you're housing ruminants with your pigs. We've mentioned school feeding before. Erysipelas is a disease that's transmitted from, well, sheep and turkeys can also get erysipelas as well as pigs, so take care of that. And I've mentioned influenza already. And again, this is, so we've got a little picture of an alpaca there. On this farm, they were using alpacas to keep the foxes away from attacking the baby piglets, which worked really well. But again, just be aware that you cannot let those alpacas have access to the pig's feed if it contains meat meal. Really important part of this whole talk is making sure that we're not introducing any diseases from overseas into our pigs. We're not allowed to import any pig products, no semen, embryos, anything like that into Australia. One of the ways, if we're going to get one of these foreign diseases in, would be through the illegal importation of pig products. And the key one that we really need to be aware of is foot and mouth disease. The outbreak of FMD in the UK in 2001 was introduced through illegal school feeding of pigs, and you know, there was basically you know, millions of animals slaughtered to eradicate that disease. More than $1 billion was spent, and the side effect of that was certainly businesses going out of, not continuing. Tourism took a big hit, and yeah, this is all through school feeding of pigs. So we have previously had foot and mouth disease in the country, not for over 100, not within the last 130 years. Pigs are a major risk factor, mainly through school feeding, but they also are amplifiers of the virus, so they do excrete a lot more virus than other ruminant species, and the virus does survive for a long period of time inside pig meat products. So it's important to be aware of that. I've mentioned African swine fever in this talk because if you've got pigs, you will have been under a rock in the last few months if you haven't heard about this. But China and Belgium have recently had bad outbreaks of African swine fever. China in particular, started in August of this year. and it's a moving feast in terms of what impact it's had on the industry. A really difficult industry to try and control because there are a really large number of backyard producers, and there's also a large wild boar population in China. So I mean, not dissimilar to, I guess, the Australian situation where we do have, 25 million odd wild pigs in this country, and a lot of people have, pigs in their backyard. So this strain of African swine fever is pretty much identical to the strain that's in Russia, and it's been thought that it was introduced into China through the illegal feeding or through feeding of pigs with contaminated pork products. The thing about African swine fever is it can look very similar to a lot of other diseases that cause just a general septicemia or blood poisoning. So basically the pigs are very lethargic, they very high temperature, their extremities go red, and so that could look very much like a bad case of erysipelas. So if you do see anything suspicious or unusual, make sure that you call your vet or the emergency animal disease hotline. In China, what impact has this disease had? Well, there's no treatment for African swine fever. Generally, pigs get infected, die. There are no commercially available vaccines. The authorities have, if there's a farm detected with swine fever, the pigs are all slaughtered, and there's certainly an increased restriction in what you can feed to your pigs in China and movement of pigs around. And there have been recently some large farms in China identified with African swine fever, so it's not just smallholder farms that have been affected. So, and certainly we don't want to be introducing that kind of disease. So I guess if you do see anything that looks unusual, so it might be unusual clinical signs, it might be an unusually high number of sick or dead animals. If you see any pig ever with blisters on its snout or on its feet, or if you see lameness, which is what you'll tend to see more commonly in something like foot and mouth disease virus, talk to your veterinarian or call the emergency animal disease watch hotline. And that's a good number just to put in your mobile phone just for a day-to-day thing. So I'll just keep going because